Hello and welcome to the Game Theory Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Vecini. We are presented by The Athletic. Today on the show, Danny Leroux is in the building. I'm realizing that my pods are the speaker right now. We'll make a quick adjustment there. Hopefully, does that sound better, Danny?
You sound good the whole time.
Sounded good the whole time. Wow, that's a good sign. Okay, so hopefully this sounds better. We are going to talk about future NBA dominoes, basically in terms of player movement, in terms of trades, the different pieces that we're looking at league-wide that could impact the future of the league. And there is an obvious place to start, and we'll start there. But first, Danny Leroux is here. Danny is the expert in all of these things. Danny, I'm sure, has read the entire CBA already, right? The new one.
Not entirely, but I've read a lot of the pertinent sections and the changes. I'll probably do the whole thing. I've been a little preoccupied, but I will. It honestly, like, a lot. It's funny. A lot of things changed, but a lot of things stayed the same. But yeah, you know, it's something you spend quality time with, and as much as you think you know it, there will be something that comes up, and it will stump me. It will stump the other people I know to ask, except for Larry Kuhn. Everyone else will be stumped, and then I'll send him a frantic email, and he'll hopefully get back to me.
It's one of those things where, like, nobody has an answer until it gets stress tested sometimes, right, too. Like, you just, like, don't know how the league will rule on things from time to time even. So
yeah, I mean, we might be dealing with one of those, and not that this is really a CBA thing, but with the Harden fine, like, the idea of, like, these can occupy different spaces and stress testing, and I mean, going back to, like, the Jeremy Lin, Omer Asik contracts and all that kind of stuff, like, that's the way this happens, and it's a kind of high stakes way to adjudicate, but hey, them's the breaks.
It's so funny, isn't it, the way that works? So we're going to start here, Danny. The big news in the NBA right now is James Harden based. James Harden was just fined $100,000 for basically saying that he won't play for the 76ers, or he's threatening not to play for the 76ers. And essentially the reason I think he got fined personally is that the league literally just very publicly released this statement about Damian Lillard, saying what would happen if somebody like Damian Lillard or other stars around the league would threaten to not actually perform the duties of their contract, which is basically what James Harden said, saying he will not play for a team that Daryl Morey works for. That is your impression on why the league took this strong of a stance, right?
Yeah, I think if a combination of that and, like, tone setting, it's like, this is the first one you always want to kind of set. You kind of want to have that as your threshold, as your boundary line, and it's always hard, because then do you step back from that and you go. But generally speaking, it was vaguely in line with what they kind of said they didn't want to see, and so you at least try to do that. I haven't gone too deep into the weeds in terms of the terminology here, but I think they'll be successful. But yeah, that's the basic idea. Is like, hey, as much as we like certain parts of this, and the drama can be a good thing for the popularity of the league, they believe there is a time and place for it, and that is their right. And, a lot of these things, it's either collectively bargained or, adjudicated. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And I get why the league did it, because essentially I am sure that Adam Silver is feeling some pretty real pressure from owners right now.
Sure.
About getting control of the league back from players in some respect. Obviously players should and do have a real sense of control over the way the league is run now, after the player empowerment era has really strongly been adjudicated and won in many cases by the players. But I think that the owners would like to bring some of that back and rein just like a little bit of that back in, which I think is why we're going to see something like this happen in terms of fines happening and in terms of the statement that the league made in terms of Damian Lillard.
For sure, and it bears repeating an emphasis every time this comes up that the commission, at the pleasure of the owners, they are not a representative of the players. They have a relationship there because that is an important part of this and every other sports business. But if somebody does something that runs afoul, especially in like a macro sense with what the ownership doesn't want, and I mean they're a lot, then that the commissioner is going to go in that direction, and that's the way it works. And then the player association is doing their job and pushing back on that and saying, trying to put their lines, and that's really the way this goes. But of course we're in the slow season, so there isn't as much going on, but like I think that the conversation about that is a lot less interesting than the conversation about why this is happening and how it could resolve. Because like I wrote a piece for The Athletic that talked about an idea that I don't think was out there enough, not that I was breaking any new ground in any semblance of form. Basically, like, okay, it seems like a part of where this tension is coming from is that Philly is pretty steadfastly prioritizing 2024 cap space. And that is going to be a big complicator in whatever resolves with James Harden. Not only potentially his contract negotiations, which originated all of this stuff, but also where this could be going from here. And that is, I tried not to lean too heavily on like what I think, though I did give an answer towards the end. But that case of, well, and that gets into what you want to talk about on the pod of like, okay, well, not whether this was right or not whether Daryl Morey or any other person involved is a liar or not, but how did this happen? Why did it happen? Is that the right approach?
So, yeah, speaking of approach, let's now just focus into what I think is the team that holds the most cards into where the league is going to go over the course of the next year, just purely in terms of player movement. A lot of the teams that are contending for the title, realistically, in my opinion, are teams that are a little bit more stable and incumbent in many cases, like the Denver Nuggets, right? Did not make many moves this offseason outside of losing Bruce Brown and drafting 3 players that are older and hopefully are going to be able to step into the rotation a little bit sooner than maybe what their draft position might indicate. Now, I'll ask this to start. If you were running the Philadelphia 76ers and James Harden goes about his process here in a similar way to how James Harden has gone about his previous processes after asking out of a place or softly asking out of a place, such as not giving effort and stealth. I don't want to say stealth tanking, because that's probably a little bit unfair, but like not necessarily playing up to the level James Harden is capable of playing. He did this in Brooklyn, did it in Houston, obviously has done it in a couple of different scenarios now. What would you prioritize in a James Harden move? And how would you go about structuring that trade?
It's a really tough place to be because the challenge for Philadelphia is assembling the best possible team in the present, because remember, they have the reigning regular season MVP, and moving forward. And so those are not necessarily congruent objectives. Like they often are, the players who are the best right now. If you could trade James Harden for Giannis Antetokounmpo. Yeah, that's going to help you in both, or Luka, or any number of other guys.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, of the pieces that are actually available, generally speaking, they're going to tilt one direction or another. That's just the way these things work. And so the fundamental challenge with Harden, and we can talk about, when we don't need to even really dwell too much on how that part of this happened, but basically you say, okay, this is where Harden is now. And I agree with you that generally speaking, the Harden dissatisfaction has generally manifested itself in terms of him playing below his standard rather than withholding services, a buzz phrase that has been around the league now for about 2 weeks. Yeah.
James isn't not going to show up.
Exactly.
James is going to show up.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm happy. Wonderful people like laid out that stuff, but it's also not what I believe to be the case. So basically, as I was getting into that tension between the near term and the long term, Philly, in part because of Tyrese Maxey, has the possibility of having a full max slot. 30% is easy, 35% is a little tricky, but doable for them if they waited. But the only way that's remotely possible is to get back very little, if not zero, salary beyond the upcoming season in a Harden deal or in any other. Maybe they're going to trade Tobias Harris. Maybe they're going to do whatever. Like, in all of those conversations, a consequence of taking on longer term money is making adding that type of player more difficult. But then you go into, well, what is in play either direction? And the other part of this is a kind of a classic tension. And like, I think of the CJ McCollum negotiations as a good part of this, or, incidentally, Kevin Durant with the Nets, where generally speaking, you trade a good player, especially a good older player, for more long-term assets, developmental stuff, because that's what those teams have to offer, and because teams that are good now are the ones who are going to want a player like that, and teams that are good now are going to want to keep their other good players because they're trying to maximize the short term. Like the Clippers, let's say, for example, a rumored priority, if not only destination for James Harden. So if that's the case, then it's very difficult to concoct a James Harden deal that keeps the Sixers at or even close to the level that they would be if James Harden were James Harden. However, this is the riskier part of it that I think, and you know this, but it bears repeating. We can't assume that the Sixers are going to have access to that James Harden. And even that a max, the best iteration of James Harden at this point in his career, let's say he, takes amazing care of himself and everything else, is going to be the same. Every year you expect, once a player is past their prime, you expect them that the reasonable expectation is that they'll be worse. They could be only slightly worse, they could be basically the same, or they could be a whole heck of a lot worse. We don't know, but that's the way it goes. So the idea of, okay, we're going to move James Harden in a deal that keeps us as good, and I mean, in a dream world, makes us even better. That's really hard to do. And like almost all you could think of the trade partners, the teams that would want James Harden, especially with the Rockets largely out of the mix, are not really going to make those kind of offers that are going to fill, even if you are a believer that Tyrese Maxey can take a lot of this playmaking responsibility and do a great job. And I love Tyrese Maxey, maybe he can. But that's just, it's a hard thing to do. And so it as a kind of concept, like, the real downside risk for the Sixers is not so much, they'll be a bad team forever or anything silly like that. It's, you're taking a real step back right now, and it just so happens that you have this star player who you do have under contract, but who is in some of the best years of his career, who just won regular season MVP, who is a wonderful player. And so I ended my piece with like, is this worth it? And we'll get into the other parts of it. And I'm like, yes, if, and the if is Joel Embiid. Because... but here's the other thing. Even if Joel Embiid is fully on board, if he is down with this process, which is different than the process, you still have to absolutely nail the landing. Like that is it. It's like I made the analogy in the piece of, it's like a diver that knows they need to put up a more difficult dive than they anticipated to win the competition. And there's a chance they do it, but there's also a chance that when you do that you end up in a worse position because you tried to do something harder, you tried to do something that was very difficult. And that could be like I think back to Gordon Hayward with the Celtics. You got the right guy, arguably, but he just got hurt, and that sucks. And Danny Ainge didn't do anything wrong there. He didn't go out there and hit Gordon Hayward on the first minute of the game with a baseball bat. But that is a really difficult, stressful place. But you could still argue the Sixers were going to be in that sort of a place with Joel, or, like almost any key player, any key team with any key player, especially when the surrounding roster isn't quite as good as some of the other teams, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. And to me, the Embiid tension is ultimately the entire conversation here, right? Because that's what makes this so hard of a needle to thread. If Joel Embiid is okay with taking a small step back for the 2023-24 season in order for the team to have max cap space, and then thus be willing to try and get a max cap spot, and then continue to stay with the 76ers and work within that new max cap player that you're bringing in and that kind of structure, while also maxing out Tyrese Maxey, and then maxing out all of your flexibility moving forward by doing that, that's where you can go about this longer term trajectory, I think. I've been wondering if part of the reason that they have chosen not to extend Maxey is in part for what you're saying. It creates the real flexibility for max cap space. But B, it actually makes him more tradable. It actually makes him tradable, period, to be able to maneuver on the fly because James is asked out and because Joel wants to compete now. Because at the end of the day, the reality is if they have to move James Harden for essentially pieces that are forward facing or expiring contracts, right? They are probably not going to contend this year. And thus, even if you get a max player in the offseason, you are probably not going to contend next year either while you build up that continuity that you need in order to compete for a title long term. So I wonder if Joel would see this as not just wasting 2023-24, but also potentially wasting 2024-25 while building up that necessary kind of team structure that you need in order to win, and thus potentially wasting the 2 best remaining years of his career by James essentially asking out and not going out and getting another star for him in this 2023-24 season.
It is certainly a reasonable interpretation, though not the only one. There have been a lot of teams in recent vintage that have come together quickly enough. You do go the Celtics with Ray Allen and KG and Paul Pierce. The Warriors with Durant are such an anomaly because that team was arguably the most talented in NBA history. So it's like, yeah, they could give you like they're not their best punch and still win. But it does happen. I mean, Miami absolutely could have won the title in their first year as well. So, but the idea of them not being the best version, I think that's completely fair because especially in this iteration, like even if you take the like they get a really good max player, they're going to be taking this down not all the way to the studs, but pretty close. Like, and so it's going to take a little bit to, so you're going to need some minimum players to hit, you're going to need the room exception to be a wonderful player if we're going into this scenario, ideally somebody who's probably going to have to close games for you in that season. And so it could work, but you're right that it is a difficult thing. And the sales pitch for Embiid is like, well, with James Harden wanting his way out, then we're going to do that. Now, of course, an important part of this is one of the reasons James Harden presumably wants his way out is that the Sixers were reluctant to give him longer term money. That's why this framing is so important, is the idea that not that I think James Harden was the savior there necessarily. I mean, I've never been, this version of James Harden I don't think does that. But they could have had him in the fold. It seems to me that this was not inevitable. It just became inevitable based on the decisions that people have made, even if those decisions were justified and may end up being proven correct, which they very well could. And I actually kind of expect that they will.
So I say all of this to say, I think there are 2 pathways well, 3. You laid out the first one, which is they trade James for cap space, basically, right? The problem with that idea is the cap space idea is essentially to go get one of like Kawhi, Paul George, or somebody like that. Right, like they're very.
I can run through. So what I would say would be like kind of quote unquote top 5. We won't count LeBron in this, though technically LeBron could be a free agent next year. We don't know. But the 5 that I've kind of fixated on for them are as like kind of arguably max level players, whether or not they sign that as an actual contract. Kawhi, Paul George, Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, and former Sixers Jrue Holiday. And one of the challenges is 3 of those 5 are on teams that have high hopes for this year. Like you could make an argument that their best case scenario is better than the Sixers' realistic best case scenario. And then Siakam and OG Anunoby are complicated for a variety of reasons, but we don't know that they're going to hit free agency. Like it could be that they sign an extension, or it could be like they get traded somewhere else and that team then, sets their ducks in a row, incidentally, like the Sixers did years ago with Tobias Harris. Like the circumstance where they never truly hit the open market. And so I like a lot of those guys with Embiid and Maxey, if we think of that as the foundation. Like, for example, Siakam, fellow Cameroonian, the defense would be really interesting. I don't love all the spacing stuff. But Anunoby, like one of the best one-on-one defenders in the league, he has explored the studio space a lot offensively, and incidentally, the coach who let him do that, Nick Nurse, is now the coach in Philly. But I think he'd be a wonderful fit, kind of the version of him on paper, and also Anunoby's young enough that we could still see his best years, as opposed to, most guys who hit unrestricted free agency are in their 30s, and that's just not what we're going to see. And then there's also there's the offshoot path, which is like you get 2 non-max guys to take a little less, and that group could include something like Miles Bridges or like the aforementioned Gordon Hayward, or nobody in the world has any idea what Klay Thompson's situation is. But like you could concoct a thing where you get 2 pretty good players and that are willing to come on board, and maybe you could even do a wink and a nod, and you can give them a little bit more in a couple of years. But that's the cap space path for a free agent. There's also the offshoot of trading for somebody, but the challenge there is if you're trading for somebody better than those like top 5 guys I was talking about, that team is going to want assets. You're not going to, unless it's Bradley Beal with his no trade clause, you're not going to be able to get much of those players for basically nothing, or or even like what the Sixers have to offer.
So my problem with the free agency path is I think you are basically limiting yourself if you want to stay as a title contender. I don't, as much as I love OG Anunoby, and I do, a team with Tyrese Maxey, OG Anunoby, Joel Embiid, and like very little else does not win a title.
I agree.
I don't think it does. I feel the same about Drew Holiday, to be honest. I don't think that team wins a title. The guys that I think you can reasonably make a case for is if Paul George is still 100% healthy and gets through a whole playoffs. Kawhi Leonard, if he's 100% healthy, gets through playoffs, and LeBron. Like, I think LeBron is an interesting case at the very least.
I'll add in
what LeBron wants.
I'll add in there's an interesting, I don't fully support it, argument for Siakam, in the sense that one of the elements of Siakam's offensive game is that he's done a lot of like stuff on the ball, and suddenly with Nick Nurse as his coach. And there might be a more efficient version of him playing alongside 2 offensive players who are better than he is. And I mean, Siakam, and the defensive case is pretty obvious for him. I'm not persuaded by it necessarily, but I do think that there is an argument that a max, like Pascal Siakam taking a half step back on offense and a half step forward on defense, is a nasty complementary player alongside Embiid specifically.
I'm intrigued by that concept. I would want to get in contact with Pascal Siakam's representation now and like see what his opinions are on Nick Nurse and see what his opinions are on Joel and like understand a little bit more about that. I'm not saying tampering. I'm saying
And Sam, that's the funniest thing is that 3 of the 5 guys that we're talking about have experience with Nick Nurse, because of course Kawhi does as well. So their thoughts on this could be very salient.
And I think that is an intriguing potential pathway. The second pathway is combining Tyrese Maxey and Tobias Harris to go out and try and get a star that could be available now, right? You could try and go out and get Pascal Siakam. You can't really do that, I don't think, because if you do that, I think you are basically limiting yourself at that point in terms of ceiling. Because if you're going out and you're getting Pascal Siakam, you could theoretically do that in the offseason this year in the pathway that you said, right? There are very few other stars that are actually available right now and that actually work with Embiid. Like you might be able to go out and get like somebody like Karl Anthony Towns. And I wouldn't go out and say that I would move Tyrese Maxey for Karl Towns. I personally would not do that. I'm just saying, like, if you're trying to build a second star around Joel Embiid, a theoretical pathway is using the Maxey asset, using the Tobias Harris expiring contract, combining those two and trying to go out and get a star. Is there anybody that you can look at as a theoretical option that makes sense there?
No, there isn't anybody that really stands out to me. The best, a lot of the like top 20 players in the league aren't really available. And I mean, or they're in circumstances where their team is happy with them, or they're available but aren't necessarily a great fit. Like is there a case for like Damian Lillard? Yeah, maybe, but like he's paid a lot of money during this time, and it doesn't seem like he wants to be there. And you could think about something like that, but also like if let's say you're doing it for Lillard, like your timeline gets a little bit thorny here. It's like you got, as much as I love Dame and he's been wonderful when he's been healthy, like if he ages like any sort of normal human being, you got a couple of years probably, and you're paying him for a lot more than those two because of the extension he signed. And so that's risky too. Like it's a risky proposition. And the other part is like, to me, if you're trading Maxey, part of the logic there is you want to get somebody who either is like a true 1 or 1A, or who is young enough that you could see something else. Like to me, getting a 38 or 30, not 38, like a 33-year-old star with that, well, then you're kind of in a similar boat. Like you're trading Maxey, you're mortgaging the future. It doesn't have to be as extreme as how badly the Rudy Gobert trade worked out, because very few things ever do. But because generally speaking, like Jaylen Browns don't become available every day, and that's the way it kind of works.
There is one theoretical player out there that I think you can make this case for. And by the way, this strategy then would include moving James Harden essentially for expiring players that are a little bit more like, you could do the Clippers trade at that point for their expiring veterans at this point.
Sure.
There's one player that I think you can make even the smallest logical sense for this.
Okay.
For. And
I'm interested.
And it would involve, you'd have to add multiple picks to do this as well. Trae Young. Because I think if you're Atlanta, you can make a case that Tyrese Maxey is a, potentially interesting fit with DeJounte Murray. And the Tobias Harris deal allows you to cut some money in some respect, right? And it seems like Atlanta in some way is like cost conscious, right? It also gives you like a slightly more flexible outcome here in terms of if you acquire picks as well. That's the only name that I can even make the smallest amount of sense for. I think Atlanta would have better offers for Trae Young if they decided to go down this road of moving Trae Young, and I'm not advocating them moving Trae Young. I'm just trying to even come up with the slightest theoretical outcome here that you could make a case for.
Trae's compelling, to be sure. And I mean, I think that at times his star around the league has actually been a little underappreciated, just because, he is a player who, when you put him on a team, generally they're going to have a consistently strong offense. And like, he's done that. Now, they were hurt last year by having significantly worse spacing. That's what happens when you give up some of your best shooters, or they're hurt, which happened for them as well. Yeah. But it is like, the idea that Young can propel the offense, and Trae Young's off-ball game at times is underappreciated. Now, putting him off-ball alongside DeJounte Murray isn't quite the same thing as doing so alongside Joel Embiid, because Joel Embiid, he occupies a different space on the floor. He occupies the defense in a very different way. But the other part of that, if I were in Daryl Morey's shoes, is where does that put you, and like also the salary structure there, because you're punting on max space, because Trae Young makes a lot of money right now, and Trae Young, he is a very talented player, but he has specific flaws in the playoffs. He's a very limited defender, and the idea that part of what you love about Joel Embiid is that he can occupy a larger offensive role than every center that isn't named Nikola Jokic, and he can do that. Well, then you don't need an on-ball dynamo necessarily in the same sense, though I generally believe the more good on-ball players you have, the better you're going to be if they can shoot, which Trae generally can. And so I think that there is a logic to it, but as you said, I think that the other challenge of that negotiation is in part because of where Philly stands. It's hard to have the best offer, because unless they left Tyrese Maxey, and in that case, then like maybe there's a case that Landry Fields, and more importantly, because these are ownership level decisions primarily, ownership is like, oh, maybe we can thread the needle here, maybe we can not be as bad, we can do that, and Atlanta's out a couple of their own future firsts because of the DeJounte deal, so there is a benefit to them of staying relevant. So maybe I don't, but again, like we talked about this in terms of the cap space route, and there's going to be a theme here. I don't think that, to me, Trae and Joel, especially if it's a limited supporting cast, that is good enough to get you all the way there.
So the only reason I say maybe to that is that in terms of that being an idea, is that I think you can make the case that it's very similar to what Daryl Morey was trying to do with James Harden.
Sure.
Having this dominant pick and roll playmaking guard next to Joel Embiid. Again, I don't really think it makes a lot of sense for Atlanta. I'm just coming up with like the only name that I can theoretically think that could hit the market that could make even like the smallest amount of sense. The final pathway here to me is attaching picks to Harden to try and get somebody else. And Zach Hoke in the YouTube comments brings up the idea of trying to do Harden and multiple firsts for somebody like Zach LaVine. Getting somebody like LaVine plus multiple firsts might allow you to then re-sign Maxey, use the Tobias Harris expiring to go out and maybe get like some bad money on your roster that could actually have like good players, but bad money. They're like slightly overpaid. And then you have a core of Maxey, LaVine, using the expiring Harris money to take on some longer term money to maybe go about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a possibility there too. And LaVine, his ability to play kind of on ball and off ball. Basically, the idea is, can you get somebody who is better than the players that you could potentially use cap space on, acknowledging that like getting Zach LaVine is a certainty. He is on your roster. He is under contract. Whereas any one of the players we're talking about, not only is it uncertain whether they are even going to hit the market, but much less whether they will actually choose you over everyone else, including their current team. And so there is, and the idea that you can be more viable in the near term. Because like the idea is that Zach LaVine will be better for you than whatever iteration of James Harden you would expect to get. Yeah. So yeah, I do think that there's merit to that. And that's the other part of the approach with the Sixers that has been so dangerous, is that like not only is it that Harden is in a different place, but one of the underappreciated parts of their offseason is like they let some valued contributors go for reasonable contracts. Shake Milton is now on the Timberwolves. George Niang is on the Cavs. And it's not like those guys broke the bank. It's not a Bruce Brown situation where like, hey, you player helped you win a championship. He signed for way more money than you could offer. Congratulations, move on. It was in part probably weird with Milton because he had his non-guaranteed second year. The idea that they didn't want these sorts of commitments. If they had gone down this route from the beginning, then they could have theoretically, they could have done that pivot, and like they could have done that even by doing a Clippers trade earlier, and then you reroute some of the stuff and everything else. But yeah, I think that there's some merit to that. The challenge with those deals, I'm not saying this is a bad idea. I appreciate Zach for bringing it up. Is a lot of the teams in that boat don't think they're in that boat. Like Chicago is the fantastic example. It's like, would Chicago be in a better situation if they traded Zach LaVine for expiring contracts, especially if they could get some first-round picks that had some real sizzle? I think yes. But I'm not Arturis. And Arturis, their general manager, who built this team and who believes that this team could still be good, I think it's more likely that they extend DeMar DeRozan at a high wage than that they trade Zach LaVine. And he is entrusted to do that by ownership and everything else. And so you're looking for like, it's not that you're looking for a needle in a haystack. They're like, Zach LaVine is a very good player. Like these are established commodities and everything else. Mm-hmm. It's you're looking for a player who is simultaneously available and someone who is interested in buying what you are selling. And that basically means that they're looking to cash out and sell and transition into a different direction.
Yeah. No, I think that's right.
It's a great question, though.
And that is why if a deal like that was to happen, you would have to do this, I think, by holding on to Harden for the first 30-ish games of the season, probably, and holding your nose and praying that this doesn't become a disaster. And that feels kind of dangerous to me personally.
Sure.
And that's why this whole thing is interesting to me, because James, I think, is going to be pretty tough to be around, given what his current inclination seems to be. We've talked a lot about Philly, and there's still one final question here that I think we need to ask at the end of the day. Let's say this goes as badly as it could. And I think that there's a real chance it could go this badly. That results in Joel Embiid asking out, right? Like this, we're now officially on like Joel Embiid watch, in my opinion. I understand that Sixers fans, like, that sucks, but it is obvious. Like, we are 100% on Joel Embiid watch if this Harden thing goes very poorly. This is like potentially the first step of Joel Embiid being very frustrated with the organization. And I'm not saying that from inside information. I'm saying that just in terms of logic, that feels fair, right?
It does. And if it provides some solace to Phillies fans, we were on Giannis Antetokounmpo watch until we weren't. Like this can be a circumstance where the player just, no drama, re-ups, or that the team kind of it resolves in the other way of like, okay, this all kind of fit together. It does not mean in any way, shape, or form that player is gone. It's a done deal, whether it's through free agency or a trade or whatever. Yeah. But the history of modern NBA basketball is that high-level players do not tolerate being on teams without championship viability for very long. Like that is the way it works. Now, it could be a circumstance where, the team, the seas change and they kind of think that they could turn around, or there's a sudden injury or something else. Like, yeah, that can happen for sure. But it is generally the way these things work. And so that is real pressure. That is pressure for Daryl Morey. That is pressure for ownership to not only being willing to embrace whatever approach, but also being willing to spend should that approach, whatever that ends up being. Because remember that you have this narrow window. Let's say they do the cap space route. You need Harris or whoever is owning the Sixers at that point to be willing to kind of use those middle years to build up the roster and eventually pay like probably second tax level when Joel Embiid gets into his next contract. And, but for Embiid, I mean, there is no requirement. And what I always say in these circumstances, just like in free agency, is like players, all they can do is be honest with themselves and what they want to do. And if they want to stay where they are, more power to them. If they want to go somewhere else, more power to them there. So it is a very, it is the most common thing to happen there should it go poorly. And that does not mean it is definite. That does not mean the die is cast, but it does mean it's a serious possibility. And that might be another consideration you brought up, the idea of with Maxey. And I don't think Daryl Morey wants to tear this down. I don't think anyone really does at this moment in time.
I don't think so either.
But let's say Tyrese Maxey justifiably comes at this from the perspective of like, hey, like I've been a very good player. Like you can look at what some of the other, and you could argue, and I would, that he's better than some of the Pools and Heroes of the world.
Yep.
Like the kind of extension that he would accept is a little bit close. Let's say theoretically, I don't have any inside information on this, to what he could get in free agency. Well, then as the Sixers, you're not you're sacrificing a lot signing him now, because you're getting that, and because you lose this cap space idea, and you hope that they never turn into a pumpkin, but recent past shows that they can. And so,
at least in terms of trade value,
right? And so the idea is that from the perspective of, if you need to change course, whether that's changing because things go really well or changing because things go really poorly, not having Maxey locked in makes a lot of sense. And there's also the risk, and one of the things you and I haven't talked about is going back to one of the highest profile free agents that the Sixers could get in 24 is Kawhi Leonard. One of the rumored reasons that his relationship soured with the Spurs was their reluctance, or let's say refusal in the endgame, to give him that extension. They played this game and, they got LaMarcus Aldridge out of it. It's not like they, struck out or anything else, but, you lose that security and everything else. And so there is no guarantee, again, that this will happen with them. Like Andre Drummond stayed happily on the Pistons after they did a similar thing. It can happen. But the idea, like I generally think like no drama extensions, I've become more amenable to them recently, because it's just like, you don't want to cause all this stuff if you have a general idea. But the idea of a high level team having cap space, and like if Maxey's willing to take like 10 million less than his maximum, of course, then you consider that and you just roll with it and you do everything else. But yeah, it's a fair consideration.
I think that the way that we just explained this, I think kind of crystallizes, in my opinion, how Philly should go about this. If I was Philly, the first thing I would be doing would be exploring the James Harden plus first round picks market. Because even if you move James Harden and you move out those future first round picks, and this goes completely fucking haywire, and you end up having to move Joel, you're going to recoup a lot of those firsts anyway. by moving Joel Embiid, right? That seems fair.
And you put, one other challenge for Philly. This came up a little bit in my piece. It's hard for them to trade firsts right now because of the ones that they already have owed, but they can do some, like we're using first as a proxy for assets. Like there are other things they could do.
Yeah. Like they have, I believe, their own 2024. They owe out their 2025. They owe out a current 2027 that likely will be a 2027 because the 2025 they owe out is only like top 4 protected or something. So the reason I say all of this is to say they could still move their 2029 pick. They could move a bunch of pick swaps if they want to. I would be trying to do that. I would be trying to move out that plus Harden for a better player or like a top 50-ish player in the league. That's the way I would go about this. And then hoping that player is on an expiring contract in some way, shape, or form. Honestly, like I would do like James Harden and a first probably for DeMar DeRozan. That seems kind of wild on its face, but I feel like that allows you to contend now. It allows you to have potential flexibility in the offseason to go out and try and get a Kawhi Leonard or a DeMar DeRozan or Paul George. And if they don't resign, you can still pay DeMar more than anybody else can. Mm-hmm. And you might have a chance at retaining him. That's the kind of deal I'd be trying to do if I was Daryl Morey. I don't know if Chicago has any interest in that. They probably don't, right? But that's what I'd be trying to do. Something in that ballpark. And Phoenix asks, does DeMar really make you a contender? Honestly, probably not, but it's the closest thing I think you can do to splitting the windows.
Yeah, and it's hard because you pretty much, and it's DeRozan comes up here, you'd ideally want a player who can shoot because that gives you more flow around it. But the players who can shoot, ideally who are wing sized, are hard to come by because Tyrese Maxey is more point guard size. So you'd want somebody who's, at least 6'4". You could do it. Right. But Devin Booker or Lowry Markkanen probably aren't walking through that door. So you can kind of, you could hope for it all you want, but it's a really tough spot to be in. And
that tough spot to be in is why my next move would just be moving Harden for cap, like for veteran players that give you cap space this offseason at the end of the day.
But, and that's the funniest thing is like the Clippers offer, we don't know exactly what it was, may look better. And like, let's say it's, I don't know. I don't know if even Terrence Mann's included. Like, first of all, Mann probably wouldn't stick on the Sixers if they go the cap space route, just even though he's a good player at a reasonable rate, just because they only have so much wiggle room outside of this, depending on who they get. But, like those guys could help him. And if they think Maxey can take the reins, then you could roll with it. Like the cast off Clippers actually aren't that terrible a fit with it. And maybe another team is interested. But the problem is like, James Harden, especially with with teams a lot more set right now, like where is that going to happen, and who can do that with mostly expiring contracts? It's a tough needle to thread.
And I think you have to go about it that way because if Joel asks out, you need to be able to be light on your feet and be able to then maneuver and get flexible very quickly. I think that's just kind of the reality. Like, I think you need to now be planning with this James Harden deal with the potential that Joel Embiid asks out.
Well, so, and but I want to push back on that just a little bit. I agree with you that this is a distinct possibility. Does that potential domino make you sufficiently reluctant to move firsts in the near term? Because like maybe not doing something involving your 24 or your 25, and then they already there are some conflicts there already. But like, if you think, even though that's not what you want to happen in your heart of hearts, if you think that there is a chance that Joel Embiid is going to be, that his next contract will not be signed with Philadelphia, however that happens, how comfortable are you then giving up a 2029 first round pick for a top 50 player that isn't a top 20?
I would give up a top 4 protected pick. I'd be willing to like protect it so I'm not getting crushed within the lottery, but that I am like hopefully being willing to do something like that. Right.
Yeah. I'm just saying it's a consideration because no,
100%. But I think that it's a consideration only insofar as you're going to recoup these assets anyway. if Joel asks out.
Mm-hmm.
And you just want to have access to your potential top picks at the end of the day. Like if you are going to bottom out entirely and you're going to finish in the top 4 potentially and get a top 4 pick, you want to have access to that. But otherwise, you want to do everything you can to try and support and retain Joel at the end of the day. And to me, like, this is where we want to move forward in this conversation now after 45 minutes and talk about other teams. To me, when I look at what the Knicks are doing, this feels like what the Knicks are trying to do to me. Like they're trying to best position themselves for Joel Embiid. And that comes from like no inside information. I want to be very clear about that. But like, to me, that's why you don't give all of your assets for Donovan Mitchell. You don't give all of your assets for some potential deals that occurred this summer. I think that you are hoarding for a player like Joel Embiid. And if he was to hit the market, the Knicks make the most sense to me.
The Knicks make a lot of sense as a team that would be interested, and that could potentially, depending on what the trade partner, in this case the Sixers, are looking for, give them pieces that are potentially useful. Like the Knicks have a lot of players on reasonable contracts, which can be a good thing, like especially in the light of like, if we're not talking about rookie scale guys who are generally positive value, there aren't always a ton of positive value contracts long term in the league. So the challenge with the Knicks is I think they'll always be in the room, but I think the way that they have the best offer, and this kind of came into play a little bit in the Donovan Mitchell thing. I don't love a lot of their draft assets, so like they kind of they did the volume play rather than the quality play with some of the stuff that they've done, which I mean that can work out really well for you. We've seen teams do it, but like one of the big questions that I have is like, I haven't written on this yet, but it's something I want to do this summer, is this group of teams that are all in the West, of course, that are all really asset rich and are kind of like on different timelines. So I'm talking about New Orleans, I'm talking about Utah, I'm talking about San Antonio, and why am I blanking on the last one? Oklahoma City. The challenge is, are those teams going to get in the bidding, and does the bidding ever really happen? Because we've seen players narrow the field at least a little bit. And we don't know in that case who would be necessarily running the Sixers. My instinct is that it would still be Daryl Morey, but what would they be looking for? What approach would they be doing? But yeah, I mean, I think the Knicks are reasonably well positioned, and they're even better positioned if the disgruntled player in question, whether it's Joel Embiid or somebody else, says, I'm going to narrow the field in half or in a third or whatever else, and the Knicks are probably going to be in that group.
So the reason I also say the Knicks for next offseason particularly is I think there is more value than what people think in current value in like current timeline picks, because it allows you to rebuild quicker as opposed to like waiting and waiting and waiting for all of these assets that will eventually come, but potentially after you have a job as a general manager, right? The Knicks currently have access to their own 2024. They have access to Dallas's top 10 2024 protected, so probably will go through.
Yeah.
They have a future pick from Detroit that is extended out until 2027. And it's top 18 next year, top 13 in 2025, top 11 in 2026, top 9 protected in 2027. So they're probably going to get that Detroit pick at some point. They also have a 2024 from Washington that is top 12 protected this year, top 10 protected in 2025, top 8 protected in 2026. Reasonable chance that transfers at some point as a first and as a lottery pick, I think. So you have these 2024 pick assets that are potentially really like somewhat valuable, let's call them, maybe not like exceptionally valuable, but could realistically all turn into lottery picks outside of, I think, the Dallas one. You also have, I believe, all of your own first rounders. You have a 2025 from Milwaukee, I believe.
They do, unless it's top 4, which we don't expect it to be.
Right. So you have a number of picks that are interesting, I think, to the Knicks or to Philly. And you have all of your own picks that gives them, it's a good blend of current value, which allow you to rebuild sooner for your fan base, and future value, which like if after Joel Embiid does not resign or falls off a little bit in some way, you can try and get that future value as well. And if you're the Knicks, you're probably giving up just about everything you have for Joel Embiid because this is what you've been waiting for. So you could do something like Emmanuel Quickly, the RJ Barrett deal, the Evan Fournier deal. Like if you have him opt in, essentially, that's an expiring deal. Emmanuel Quickly, these 3 2024 first round picks, and then 2 other first round picks. And that's probably more than anybody else is going to offer, would be my guess, right? Like, unless you love the Houston guys, maybe you could give me a case that Houston is a better offer.
With Embiid, there could be other teams that work their way into the conversation. Brooklyn is a potential. They have such a weird combination of stuff because they have all these Phoenix picks, but they also, Mikal Bridges, who, of course, has a history with the Philadelphia 76ers, having been his mother being a part of the organization, having been drafted by them and traded for Zaire Smith. But like there are a couple of other ones that I think could work their way in.
Like there's Oklahoma City could easily do this. City is the team.
The other wild one is New Orleans. Like New Orleans can work their way, as they reportedly did in the 2-3 stuff in the draft. Like they can work themselves into anything if they want to. It's just, do they want to? And so we'd have to wonder that. And then how much does the player fit in? And the other wild factor in all this is like, it does seem like we're in a generally stable time, but players will always shake loose. Like that's the thing that I think we've learned over the last couple of years is like there will always be someone. But Joel Embiid is a phenomenally talented someone, and he's the type of player that a group like the Knicks can prioritize. And the other thing about with New York, and I believe this to be the case, is I don't think they're necessarily building this asset salary matching base and all that for Joel Embiid specifically. However, I think they are building it for a disgruntled star. And Joel Embiid is probably their ideal of that group. But that group could include a number of other guys. And part of what makes the Knicks so fascinating is I think they were probably a lot more interested in Donovan Mitchell before Jalen Brunson was awesome last year. And now, of course, if you can add Donovan Mitchell while not giving up a ton of their stuff, like you do it. Donovan Mitchell's an amazing player. But they can now emphasize different elements of an overall good team to make it work. And so now if you want to go after a wing, if you want to go after a center like Joel Embiid, you don't need the creator now. You have Jalen Brunson is good enough to be that guy. And so that frees them up to identify other targets and work within it. Now, you're dependent on the supply here because the supply is so variable. We think it'll be somebody, but we don't know who that somebody is. So we'll have to see.
So here is now, the other teams that could be in, like obviously I mentioned Oklahoma City. I'm a little bit skeptical Oklahoma City would do this personally because it feels like they are building for the timeline after Joel is out of his prime a little bit to me, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe like Shea would speed that up in some way and some of the other guys on their roster would speed that up in some way. New Orleans, I think actually might be like the prime team that could do this. Houston is another team that like really could do this if they really wanted to. But I think New York would be inclined to offer everything, whereas maybe New Orleans would not offer everything. Maybe Houston would not offer everything. And thus that incentive to offer more and more and more would make it so New York would probably be the team that would offer most at the end of the day, even though they don't have the most to offer.
The other kind of consideration to make is I'm always interested, it doesn't happen very often, in the like talented young team that wouldn't do it through cap space. So like, what if Orlando thinks that they can play Franz Wagner and Paolo and Joel together? And they want something with that. Like they could put together a really strong offer. And we don't usually see those teams. I mean, Orlando has made some big swings in the past, but like we haven't usually seen it go in that direction, but you never know. And like,
you never know.
And Embiid is here's the other one that we have to bring up just because you always should is the Miami Heat. Like, I don't know how it would work with or without Dame, but you know, it's happened before. And
I don't think they actually have an offer that can top anything.
You want my favorite crazy one? If we're gaming this out that it's like a year or two out, Portland. The post Dame Portland Trailblazers put something together. I mean, but good Lord, would you be risking with another 7-footer, unbelievably talented with an injury history in a Trailblazers uniform? As somebody who still has Greg Oden's, his foot on tugging at my heartstrings, it would be challenging. But like the idea basically of you're not going to get anybody better than him for like there aren't going to be better players traded for a while. And, even if we said that there's going to be the cavalcade of guys just basically every year, what we haven't really mentioned anywhere here is anyone who has real top 5 credibility other than like Kevin Durant is kind of his own case, but it's rare. And that's why, we're interested in it. That's why we're talking about it, even though Joel Embiid is miles from making a trade request right now.
Yes.
And here's hoping the Sixers are so good that he never has to. But it is, it is a distinct possibility.
The interesting one for me there on Portland is what happens if they take Dame into the season. The Harden thing becomes such a fucking calamity that Joel asks out and they still have Lillard. And then you can do like shade in a million picks in like Jeremy Grant or whatever you want to do for Joel. And then you have Scoot, you could do Simon's shade in a million picks for Joel or something like that. And maybe that's your interesting move, right? It's still probably not great. It's not going to happen. That's never going to happen. But like, nonetheless, we're getting into hypothetical world. The other team I want to ask you about, because I think they are the other team that like does not really make a ton of sense to me at the moment, is the Clippers. Mm-hmm. It's very clear what the Clippers are trying to do. They are trying to position all of their salaries to expire at the same time outside of Terrence Mann, which happens to be the 2024 offseason. It is interesting to me that, as I'm sure it has gone noticed to you, that we have not heard much about Kawhi Leonard and Paul George extensions at this point. That feels of note to me because they are both extension eligible. They are both superstars. They are both top 15 players. Kawhi, throughout the second half of last season, was a top 5 player in the NBA, point blank. So where do we think the Clippers are headed now?
It is an even more fraught circumstance than I think some anticipate because they're planning on opening their new stadium. I think the last time I heard is for the 24-25 season is the last estimate. So Kawhi Leonard and Paul George have even more leverage than the lofty leverage we thought they did before. That said, if it's sort of in a way it parallels what we discussed earlier with Tyrese Maxey and his extension, where if what they're asking for is basically everything, well then you go, well, we don't need to do that now, even though you really want them to be a part of it. And I think that the Clippers are significantly more open to spending long-term for the right pieces if they come in. Like, so for example, I don't think Ballmer and Lawrence Frank would be opposed to trading Marcus Morris, Nicola Batum, Robert Covington for a really good $35 million player and have them carry out. I think they'd be fine with that, but it would need to be the right guy because you have to commit to it. And the Clippers are in the weird boat where they don't have that much committed, so they could theoretically change paths, but I don't think they'd change timelines because of the new stadium. So I think that they want to have the best team they can reasonably have. And one of the challenges is, what does that entail? Like I've been more of a Clippers optimist than I should have been a lot over the last few years. And that happens when you have Kawhi and numerous other things. But part of it is like they have this weird thing where they got all these kind of forward guys. They had a version of a switching lineup, but then a bunch of them went south at the same time, and hopefully they can return to form. And Robert Covington isn't going to be an afterthought anymore. But I mean, who knows? Who knows? And so for the Clippers, I think that one of the questions that Ballmer and Lawrence Frank have to ask and answer is there somebody, whether it's James Harden or otherwise, who can give us that undeniable element, who can give us something that when you combine it with Leonard and George, who presumably are at least a part of there in the short term, like if Kawhi Leonard and Paul George are not Clippers in 2024, I think it will be because they left via free agency than a trade. So basically you're keeping them as the lens for the current team.
But if you're planning on doing that, why wouldn't you just extend them?
because you kind of want to see where things go, and maybe the possibility of a fifth year and Steve Ballmer's money. Like, I think that they're less afraid, in part because both players have chosen to be there,
Yeah.
of them choosing something else. Like, that is a very different place to be than some of the other situations that have happened where, like, you're like, I incidentally, like Kevin Durant on the Warriors after, like, kind of later on in that, where it's like, oh, you might want to do something else, like those sorts of, or Kyrie Irving anywhere he's ever been.
Well, and frankly, like someone like Paul George, who is setting himself up very, very well for his post NBA career right now, it makes more sense for him to be in LA.
Sure.
Kawhi Leonard, it seems like, is very happy being at home, being around like his people in LA, as opposed to having to go somewhere else and like starting new. So I do think there is real value in that. I think that you're probably right that like they are probably under less pressure than most teams are.
I don't
right?
think they're as afraid of those guys leaving. And the other weird element that's I've been wrapping my head around with the Clippers. I've been working on my team by team 2024 stuff for The Athletic. And like one of the things that I brought up in is I'm like, in the basically one theory that I have for the Clippers is that either they both come back or neither comes back. Basically the idea that if, let's say Kawhi is the lead domino, but it could very easily be the other way. But let's say Kawhi leaves, maybe it's to Philly, as we were talking about before, then I don't think Paul George sticks around. He could, he would be within his rights. And so what happens then is, because of, you mentioned all the flexibility they have, all of a sudden the Clippers have over 50 million, and they might have even more than that. I haven't fully run my Excel on what it would be. Yeah, they would almost have double max cap space for next summer. Yeah. Not that there would be many other guys to get. We already ran through a lot of what that list would be. But so basically part of it might be for them, if it's an all or nothing proposition and you think it's going to be the all, but you're not as afraid of the nothing, because you'd be this major market team that is generally considered to be well run, that, yeah, you probably want to do it in the first year of the stadium. But if it ends up being the second year, 2025, we don't know what that's going to be in terms of free agency and everything else. It's not the worst thing in the world for them. And so I think that the difference with the Clippers is that their roster doesn't, there are some things they could do to make the 23-24 season better. And that's the theory with James Harden and numerous other things. But I actually think that their long-term books make complete sense on the idea that my thesis of the NBA is completely different for big market teams than non-big market teams. I don't want to say small market, just non-big. And that is, you either want to be able to bring in multiple really good players, or you want to be so full of good players that you can't add anybody else. And that's really what the Clippers have done throughout the last little bit. It's what a lot of teams screwed up in the last 2 CBAs ago now. It's not even the last CBA because I'm so old. And so maybe they're just not as afraid of that. Maybe they think we can figure this out. We can make it work. Maybe it'll take a little bit. But they have the possibility.
Okay. I think that's probably a good way to explain what they're planning on and how they go about things moving forward. I think this makes sense in terms of why James Harden just ends up in LA. I still think that this all just lines up for Harden to end up with the Clippers, right?
It does. And I think that the question that I'm lingering on with all of the Harden stuff is who bends and who breaks, because I am of the belief, and I think you are too, that we will not see the best version of James Harden, whatever that best version is, on the 76ers this year.
Yep.
And if that's the case, then you have to reanalyze, recontextualize this season anyway. That is just, if you're pricing that in, or even you're pricing that in that that's a 90% possibility rather than 100, like you and I probably are. Well, then that changes the way you think about it, and then something like the Clippers offer or something else becomes more palatable to you, because you're not comparing it to your dream, you're comparing it to your reality.
Who are the next teams that you're looking at beyond these obvious ones in terms of potential? Harden? Not for Harden. I was going to, just kind of finish up here. Who are the next teams you're looking at as real potential move spots that will shape next offseason or the season after that with player movement, either acquiring or having to move important players?
You brought up the Knicks. They're a great one. And the other group that I'm really interested, well, so there's one that I already mentioned, which is those Western Conference teams with a ton of other teams picks, the Jazz, the Thunder, the Spurs, and the Pelicans. So like if they want to do something, and there you're not necessarily signing a free agent, you're trading for somebody. But then the other ones that are really interesting to me are two teams that could either spend in 24, but probably more likely in 25, are the Brooklyn Nets and the Orlando Magic. And so both of those teams, they could have a lot of space whenever, like probably in 25 for both, though the Magic especially could do it 24, no problem. And have enough good players around that talent could be interested in them. They also have matching salaries, so they could do it via trade if they want to, and maybe that's more palatable. Maybe that's more plausible for them. And they also are good enough potentially that players could be like, hey, like that's a fun place to go. That's it's like players like Orlando. So there are some players who like Orlando. There's of course plenty of players who like Brooklyn. And
Orlando, no state income tax is actually
correct.
Like a big factor there.
It is. Yeah. It is. And incidentally, a lot of players spent time there in the bubble too. Maybe some of them had affinity. Plenty of them probably didn't. Not that was the city of Orlando's fault in any way, shape, or form. And so that kind of idea, and I think broadly speaking, one of the points that I wanted to make before we went away is that it's looking overwhelmingly likely that we are not in the cap space maximization paradigm for this CBA, because basically, for no fault of anybody's part, the owners and players did not want what happened in 2016 to happen again. They didn't want a spike, even if revenues go up, and that would be great for a lot of people. Rising tide lifts a whole lot of boats, especially for the players. But the 10%, it not being the CBA, the new CBA doesn't allow the cap to rise more than 10% in a given season. And so what that means is you're not going to see these like wild swings, and you're not going to see like really good teams have cap space that often, unless they make a concerted effort like Philadelphia may be doing right now. And so what I think that means is we're going to see more situations like what happened with Damian Lillard, more situations like what happened with Kevin Durant, where players take the money when they can, as is their right. No, I have no problem with that, of course. And then if they want out after that, or Bradley Beal is a great example of this too. If they want out after that, then they'll probably get it. And maybe they don't get it in the first week. Maybe they don't get it in the first 2 months. Maybe they get it later. And how there are a couple, and this is a big part of the idea I was talking about before about big market versus non-big market, where you can roll those dice a couple of times if you're the Clippers, if you're the Lakers, if you're the Knicks. Some would argue maybe the Nets or the Warriors, depending on how you perceive market size and everything else. But everyone else, I think you need to be behaving as if the way that you get a star player is A, drafting them, because that's the way that it's almost always going to be, or B, trading for them, that it's not signing them with cap space. And so we're going to see more teams move in that direction more aggressively, and that's just the world we live in for now. And I personally, I loved the cap space survey. I loved the the wooing and the frantic reporting of like that Kevin Durant Clippers one where like everyone was crying, or the Blake Griffin with the shirts and everything else. I love that. And it makes my job more fun. But what our part of our job is understanding where things are going and where things are.
Yeah.
And I think that's where they're going.
I think I agree with you. The other spot that I'm really looking at right now is trying to figure out what Minnesota does.
Oh, well, I can tell you, they're really in a hard way in terms of the finances here, because so like one way of putting this is they are 20 million below next. So this isn't for the coming year; it's for the year after. They're 20 million below the tax with nothing for Jaden McDaniels or Mike Conley, and that includes waiving Shake Milton and Troy Brown Jr. who have non-guarantees. They either ownership is going to pony up and pay one of the biggest bills we've seen in non-Ballmer, non-Lacob, iterations, or they're going to lose someone good, someone real good.
They need to make some sort of move here. It just has, we're at the point where it's going to have to come. We're at a pressure point for them. And we're at that pressure point in part. And I think they'll probably go through with like the first half of this season and see what the Karl Towns, Rudy Gobert thing looks like, given the fact that we didn't get a chance to see much of it last year. The Towns injury last year, more than anything, really hindered Minnesota's decision-making in terms of its future, even more than like what their overall import was last year, right? Whether or not they could win a title last year. I don't think many people thought they'd win a title. I think that people thought that like maybe they would contend and be a really good regular season team, and then they'd be ready to go this season. I don't think that really changes given the fact they've had an off season together now. Hopefully they've had a chance to like really grow and mature. I think that it just extended out that window of uncertainty above all. And now they have like a real level. Like if you were engaged in the Karl Towns, Rudy Gobert combination, which I think that Minnesota is probably more optimistic on that front than anybody else is maybe a fair way to put it. I don't know if you have the answer yet on that. And you're going to have to go through part of this season at least and find out. And then you're going to have to find out what the actual market is for Towns and Gobert and figure out what the overall fit is with Anthony Edwards, because Anthony Edwards' presence in Minnesota is what makes this so important. Because as we've seen for Team USA, as we have seen throughout the latter portion of last season, Anthony Edwards looks like a future top 10 player in the league at this point. And that's putting it conservatively, I think. There's a chance he's a top 5 guy at some point. And how Minnesota handles this now over the course of the next year is going to be really, really important in terms of figuring out the trajectory of the league, but also the trajectory of this potential top 5 guy in the league's career.
It is. And the finances are one part of it, but also like the quality of the team on the court is another. And one consideration, not that I think that Minnesota will handle it in this way with however we're defining their ownership group, because it's still the awkward transition between Taylor and Laurie and A-Rod and everything else, is technically speaking, you don't have to, your tax number is not calculated until the end of that season. So they could theoretically start further over and then shed during. But the problem is, A, with the salary floor the way it is now, and B, just as a practical consideration with the nature of how people are handling financial risk or really any kind of risk, we don't really see that. So the idea is that some version of ducks are going to need to be in a row by October 1st and probably by July 15th. Like that's just the way that this is going to work. Doesn't have to be July 1st, but July 15th, I think by that point, you need to know. And what Minnesota's, I think the biggest question that Tim Connolly and ownership, because again, ownership level conversation, needs to figure out is how essential is Karl-Anthony Towns to that? Because while in an ideal world, I think you'd rather keep Towns than Gobert, because, and you could potentially keep both and lose a lot of other support things. Like we'll say Edwards is the only set piece. You can, write it down in indelible ink for the near term. Is the problem is, I think that there will be problem. The situation is that there will be more suitors for Towns. He's younger, he's intriguing, and like the last couple of years have been weird, but like he still is a very talented player. Whereas Gobert is more of a known commodity, and I think his age is a little bit of a deterrent. And so I think that there's a chance that even though the Wolves like Towns better, I'm not saying they do, but like I believe that there's a reasonable case that they still end up saving the money by moving him because there are more suitors and because you can build. It's actually more straightforward to build a great team with Gobert, Edwards, McDaniels, maybe Conley, maybe not, and what you can get for Towns than that replacing Towns and Gobert.
Are we sure that Towns' contract, which will pay him $62 million in 2027-28, is more valuable than Gobert's, who will only make $46 million in 2025-26 before expiring on a player option, by the way?
We are not. However, the general, though not exclusive, understanding, and I think of Russell Westbrook for this because he got traded so many times in the contract, is that broadly speaking, there will always be a few front offices around the league that say, is this player worth it or could they be worth it now?
Yeah.
And then you just say whatever happens after that. Incidentally, that's probably part of the logic Minnesota used with the Gobert contract. It doesn't necessarily lead to good trades, but it can lead to viable trade partners. And that's really what they're looking for.
And look, the Washington deal with Russell Westbrook ended up returning Kyle Kuzma, right?
Right.
And Kyle Kuzma, whatever you think of him, probably at the very least a top 70 player in the league, something like that, right? Like he's a top half of the league starter at the very least, I would say. And that's if you think low of him, right?
Sure.
Like you're at least getting back somebody of real import and value. I say at that point. So Minnesota is one I'm really looking at. Obviously Milwaukee is going to be really important here because of the Giannis situation. For people who don't know, Giannis's contract is currently extension eligible, but he has a player option after the 2024-25 season. So this is theoretically his second to last year on this deal with Milwaukee. Interesting scenario. Obviously, the Bucks will have to try and figure that out. Also, I think there is a real case that it just does not make financial sense for him to sign this extension right now.
I agree.
We have no evidence that he's upset. We have no evidence that he's unhappy. I just want to be clear that that is a team of import. The other team that I've kind of alluded to a couple of times that I'm really intrigued to watch here is actually Houston. Houston has built up this young crew of interesting players. Jalen Green, Jabari Smith, Alperen Şengün, Amen Thompson, all of the other guys. Tari Eason certainly is another one. They have this weird Kevin Porter contract that can be used either as an asset if you like the player or as an expiring if you don't. Like, they are very, 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 very well positioned to get into star trade conversations. And they're a big market in a state that does not have income tax.
Mm-hmm. Not
have state income tax, I want to mention.
I'll add one more because you brought up Milwaukee, more of a, not like a next 6 month team, but more of a next 12-month team. And that's the Cleveland Cavaliers, because that opens up what in the world is going to happen with Donovan Mitchell. He has a lot of decisions to make. The Cavs have a lot of decisions to make, but basically Cleveland, who remember was one of the league's best regular season teams last year. They had, and that they had a horrendous exit from the playoffs, and there are a lot of other things that we can discuss with them. But basically, there are a series of decisions that are and are not in the organization's control that could have a real impact around the league. Because, like, if Donovan Mitchell says he wants to stay, maybe they have to reevaluate some of these finances, because once all 4 of their best players are getting paid, it is a very different calculation than right now where it's only 3. And if Mitchell decides he wants to be elsewhere, then that becomes another huge question mark in all this. And so I'm really interested in Cleveland, both with the Mitchell lens and also the idea that it's like this really exciting young team that has a lot to prove and has a, could end up being a huge factor in all this.
Yeah. No, I think that this is not a bad situation to watch at the very least, because how they perform this year probably will play the role in how they build next offseason. Like, if they take a step back this year, if they win 45 games and Donovan Mitchell is now on an expiring deal and they lose in the first round of the playoffs again, that now becomes like a very real conversation about how you go forward with Donovan Mitchell and whether or not you do. And I think that they would probably try and move Jared Allen before they would move Donovan Mitchell, and they try and do like a couple of different things in order to, finagle around Donovan Mitchell as opposed to trade him first. I wonder if they start out like kind of 500 this year as opposed to what they did last year, if we don't see a Jared Allen trade, to be honest, because that's something that they are now under time pressure as an organization. Donovan Mitchell is now under time. He is under time pressure. So they have to make moves within that time period to find out what their ceiling is with this core. And to me, the guy that you move there is Jared Allen. So he's kind of like the sneaky, I don't even know about sneaky. Like, it's not that sneaky. It's just like, he's the guy I'm looking at as like a player that I think theoretically could get moved.
Absolutely a possibility.
Okay. Those are the big ones, I would say. Utah, you've mentioned these teams like Utah, Oklahoma City, New Orleans, certainly the teams in the West that have a lot of these assets. It feels like to me like that's really where we're at. Brooklyn obviously is another situation that could be interesting. We're probably 2 years away, I think, from Boston being a financially interesting situation with both Jalen and Jason making as much money as they are. I think those are really the pressure points, right? So the last question I will ask you here before we leave is, moving forward, you have gone through the collective bargaining agreement, at the very least, the important points. Is there something that you're looking at that people are not talking about as an interesting potential pressure point from the collective bargaining agreement point of view that could lead to more, less movement, anything like that?
I think I already brought it up a little bit, but the cap never going up more than 10%. I think that's the big one, because what that means is that there's a lot less variance in terms of how much teams can have to spend, and really, and because while 10% can be a lot of money, like 10% of $100 million is a lot of money. And when you get up to 200 and 300 billion, I was working on like, basically it's in a piece that's not yet published, but like, what does that 10% look like? But remember that contracts for the best players in the league are like for the most expensive guys in your books are going to go up either 8% or 5% a year. And so a lot of that ends up getting consumed by the raises within. And then a lot of other times, like you could, for example, the Cavs, like, Evan Mobley's going to get his raise at some point. And, and if you have a guy on a below market contract, the assumption has to be that they're going to go. And sure, there are Tobias Harrises of the world too, who may take a diminished role or who may just be gone entirely. But the idea that there probably aren't going to be that many teams that have championship upside if they bring in one more guy and have max cap space. I think that for the next 5 years, that's going to be a rarity. Not zero. Like Philly next year is a distinct possibility. But 2025, we'll see where some of those guys shake out. But especially if we get another round of high-level players taking extensions, which is, I think, where we're generally going, there will be some exceptions. But it just basically becomes, okay, well, then we just have to use a different pathway. And so I think that's one. The other, this is more of a small thing, but I know you and I are going to end up talking about this a lot. The league shifting the power of the taxpayer mid-level and the room exception is a really potentially important thing. So basically, for a lot of the life of neither of those exceptions have been around forever, but the room exception is more recent. The room exception was pretty small. It was like this little bonus thing the cap space teams got, and the taxpayer mid-level was like, a solid contributor. They flipped it in the new CBA. So like for the current year, it's $7.7 million for the room exception, and even $5 million for the taxpayer. So what that means is those are close enough that some players would choose one over the other. And remember, there are a lot of teams that don't have the taxpayer because of the second apron and everything else. Is that the room exception is now a viable way to actually add like a solid last guy. We saw the Kings do it. We saw a few other teams go that route. Micic signed. I don't know whether I believe he signed for the room exception. It could have been that amount of cap space. Either way. Yep. And that's really interesting. The idea that, and this is part of the sales pitch for Philly to bring this back all the way to the beginning, is if Philly thinks they can get not like a star, but if they think they can get a player who can be maybe 5th or 6th or 7th in minutes with that room exception, which is going to be worth roughly $8 million in the year that they potentially could have cap space, that changes things a lot. Like that could, it's a lot more valid. It's a lot more intriguing to think that you can put together a team. Like it's not just stars and scrubs. It's stars and like a decent role player and then, some minimum guys. And so that, I think we're going to see some real hits. Like we go back, like PJ Tucker is one of the best mid-level exception contracts in modern NBA history. The room exception is a little bit different, but we need to start thinking about some of those players making those kinds of waves.
This is actually my last question, and then I'm going to let you go. If I was to tell you that the top of the 2024 NBA draft, all the way through like pick 7 or 8, let's say, is quite a bit weaker than what we've seen in recent years, how do you think that would impact the planning of some of these organizations that might end up having higher end picks? And how do you think it would impact potential movement across the league?
It definitely changes things, in part because picks with that kind of upside then become less enticing. Like if you have maybe you have somebody else's pick. Like for example, the one of the ones that's been so tantalizing for a couple of years now is that the Pelicans can either get the Lakers 24 first or their 25 first. They have the choice after the lottery. Now, we expect the Lakers to be a good team next year, so like there's probably not much of that. But you get the idea that like those sorts of circumstances, and maybe teams are a little less interested in it. But I think that for some of the franchises that have been in this boat, like it's better to, like Washington, even if this wasn't exactly the right time, like they should have traded Bradley Beal years before. Even if this class ends up being worse, you still want to go down the same path because there could be players that exceed your expectations, and because you're not choosing between being a championship level team and being one of the worst teams in the league. You're choosing between being the 15th to 20th best team in the league to being the 28th best team in the league. And I don't love being in the middle if you're not going to break out of it. So it affects everything. Like I'm not going to say anything otherwise, but I don't think it changes decision making as much. And the other part of it, like because of the way they've restructured the lottery, I don't think that a single top player does that either. I think that because you only have a 25%. Now it ended up being, in my evaluation, I believe in yours too, that the top 4, top 5 in this class were very intriguing. And so then that does change things. Because then at that point, it's like, well, okay, we have the best lottery odds. We have the second best lottery odds. Yeah, we're probably not going to get
We don't want to fall out of the top 5, basically.
Yeah, we're probably not going to get Wembanyama because mathematically no one is probably going to get Victor Wembanyama. That's the way it works out. Or the next Wembanyama or whatever. Yeah. But we can get somebody who can really help us.
Yeah. But if we have a 65% chance at one of Victor Wembanyama, Scoot Henderson, or Brandon Miller, that is something that is substantial for us.
Exactly. And so I think that and you've done a great job of this. We've had these conversations both on Game Theory and on Real GM Radio about like the different ways that a class can be good or bad. But if it's, like if the top 1 to 6 is significantly worse, then that's going to change a whole lot of stuff. And then we'll see what happens at 25 and moving forward.
Yep. Okay. Danny, tell the people where they can find your work. Tell the people what's going on.
This is a quiet time for me, which is nice. But my written work is at The Athletic. I've actually had some time to write recently. And so I have one piece, the Philly piece is already out. My team by team projections are submitted. They will probably come out next week. And then I have like 3 other pieces in process. Podcasting, I've actually been on a short hiatus from Real GM Radio, but it will be back next week. And my standard off-season thing is I have 2 guests on and we talk about each division in depth. And so that will be starting next week, and as long as things go according to plan. And and then, it looks like next season is going to look a lot like last season for me, hopefully. So you can see, if you follow my work, you should hopefully get more of the same work.
Yeah. Go, follow Danny. He's the best. Danny, as you can see, best in the business when it comes to planning for the future and with just knowing basketball. He's super fun to talk to. Go follow Danny's work. Go to The Athletic. Keep me employed over there. I will be back on this show maybe tomorrow, maybe Sunday. Who the hell knows at this point? But we will be back soon. Until next time, we will talk soon.